rigor and consistency and value in the data. And so it really is kind of a badge of honor to be able to be here with you. So I was asked to give some talks related to planetary health and climate change in recent history. And citizen science works in so many spaces. I had to like really sit down and center myself and start thinking about like, well, what can I say about this that's really relevant and meaningful, right? So I had to do some research and do some lit review and all the fun stuff that we do in science. And I landed on this topic because part of what I was hearing, part of what I was seeing and feeling is the interconnectivity of us and our environment and the species around us, and hearing how worried people are. People are worried. And so that is something we share, right? But I also take a lot of inspiration from some of the citizen science folks that I work with. Gretchen LeBun was the leader of the Great Sunflower Project, who is one of my dissertation research case studies. And she told me that she would hear this story from people so often that they were so worried. And being able to participate in citizen science was empowering, and it made them feel like it's not a dead end. And so that is something that I carry forward, and I hope everybody else kind of can get that vibe too. So I like to organize talks around questions. Obviously, I had blue hair when I first started this set of slides. So I'll give you a little bit of my own background. I like to do a little bit on definitions because we all come from different walks of life. And so to kind of understand what we're all talking about, I always start with some key definitions. And then talking about like, how do we get to this notion of a climate resilient community and where ecology and citizen science fit into that picture. And although I am fairly ignorant about coastal everything because I grew up on the Great Lakes, I spent a little time trying to understand what that would look like in coastal ecosystems and like what we need to do to get to that point where we are moving toward climate resilient communities. Sound okay? Everyone on board? Awesome. You are as good as my students in verifying that everyone's awake and paying attention. So I'm not technically an ecologist, although I am an associate editor for the #2 journal in ecology, and I just got a distinguished ecologist award from a grad program. I spend a lot of time with ecologists, and I have for quite a few years now, and they forget that I'm not one of them because I love to listen and I get exposed to so many kinds of science. I just like to dabble a little bit. So I pick up words like detritus and learn how to pronounce them correctly. And I'm learning so much here, it's fabulous. Most of what my work looks at is how we can develop participatory science projects that meet the needs of diverse stakeholders, that we get good science, that we get rewarding, meaningful experiences for people, and that we support management actions that we need to kind of improve where we are in this world. And most of my training is in information technology, particularly organization science. And as Christy mentioned, actually library and archives is where you get data management expertise. Who knew? And so I come from a very different space than most of the people I work with. And that is magnificent in terms of the value that we all get out of working together. I've actually been working with Christy actively since about 2018, and to like boil a very complicated $1.2 million NSF project down into like a really brief, tiny sentence, it's like, can we use the data that reef surveyors collect to understand skill development among reef surveyors, right? So can we see that people learn from practice just from the data that they submit? And one of the reasons that we wanted to do this was that we were able to do it with the eBird data. And it was a super fun project. And we definitely could see that people improved with exposure and practice. And Reef is the most similar data to eBird that's out there, that we're aware of in terms of the contributions of structure and the volume. Oh my God, it's so much data. You guys, it is so much data. And so I dragged Christy, who went along with it so nicely, through this crazy process. She started off with a lengthy interview where we identified 21 different variables, different things that we thought might show us a little something about reef surveyor skills. And then we were like, is that really a skill or is it a measure of a skill? We kicked a couple out. We said, do you have data on it? and we kicked a couple out, and we ended up with 12 that we could actually use. Of course, we couldn't actually use that many because the complexity of the analysis and the volume of the data is prohibitive, right? So we had to like whittle it down further. And so through a number of in-person and remote kind of experiences, I made her do a Gantt chart. We also had to set up some sampling parameters in terms of what kind of data were we going to pull out from that massive, massive heap, so that the analysts could do their work. And so that was, there was a lot of thought that went into that because there are so many things you want to control for to get a really rigorous analysis out of it. And then sometime later, we finally landed on what are we actually going to look at? What are the things that we think might influence what we can see about people's observations? So that's kind of in this right part here. And moving further, we had to understand how the process of participation in Reef breaks down into things that are skill-based. So identifying and documenting fishes, among other steps, involves observing fish and identifying them to species. So the task of observing fish, you have to dive. That involves a whole lot of skills. And so we didn't break that one down further. You have to do some notes on a slate. Doesn't sound that complicated, but there are some skills involved here. You have to actually learn the right way to do it. And when you're identifying to species, you have to make an initial ID, and then hopefully confer, refine, and finally upload your data. Right? And that initial ID ends up being kind of the primary focus of some of the analyses we did, because it's actually a very hard to articulate skill. How do you know what you're seeing? Right? It takes practice, and by the time that you don't have to think about it, you've forgotten how you know. Right? So I learned this with bird ID. It's like, oh, well, it's just that, right? But it took a lot of grinding to get there. So it turns out, yes, we can actually use the Reef data to better understand how Reef surveyors learn. And we use species accumulation curves, which are used in ecology research. Usually we use it to evaluate the habitat and how biodiverse a habitat is. But we said, if we go to the same habitat and have different people counting, then we can evaluate how well the people are counting, because there's natural limits on how many species are going to be in any one place. And so the people who detect more of those species are probably somewhat more skilled at ID. Right? This usually holds up pretty well. So we controlled for so many things like bottom time and location and seasonality, like so many things. We got a fantastic analyst for Christy to work with to help with this. And our grant paid for it, not anybody's donations, just so you know. And so we have some results. They're not in publication yet, but there were multiple models of learning that were generated for Reef surveyors. Some people start at a certain point, and that's kind of where they stay. They're good. They produce data, but it doesn't shift much. Then there is sort of the quote unquote typical curve, where a lot of people increase in their rate of species accumulation at a fairly fixed pattern. So your first dive, you're going to see about this much, and you're going to improve by this much on your next dive, and by 10 dives, you're improving by this much, that kind of thing. The most interesting one to me is the variable rates. So some people increase, and they do it at their own pace. And there's so many reasons that could be. How much time is there between dives? How much support do they have? So many things, right? Many of which we can't know. And some people decrease. And there's lots of reasons that that could be happening too. Too much time between dives, doing things solo, and you just couldn't see everything. Your field of vision is limited. It's a different thing than in a group setting. And now we have a lot more questions of like why we are seeing these patterns, how we can explain this. One of the things that we did pull out was that the group size matters. And this is identical to what we see with the eBird data in birding, is the more people you have, the more reliable it is, and the higher the species detection rate, right? More ears, more eyes, more data. So that's just kind of the nutshell version of 4 or 5 years of spending some quality time together and having conversations about data. So, and also NSF is supporting my presence here, so I promised I would share a little bit about this work together. But switching gears to climate resilience. Now I'm going to go into lecturer mode. So climate resilience is basically the ability of any given system to deal with and recover from climate hazards, usually through some form of adaptation or adjustment to the situation. Community resilience, we're talking about human communities. When I use community, I mean human communities, not fish communities, not reef communities, humans, right? And this is the sustained ability to bounce back, when bad things happen. And when we're talking about climate resilience in a community setting, it's the community's ability to see the risks, plan to do something about it, assess where they're at, what puts them in danger, what they have to leverage against that, and then start implementing solutions. That's the space we would love to see people moving in. Now, anyone not know what citizen science is in this room? Yes, my people. So I refer to this interchangeably as citizen science, community science, participatory science. There are politics with labels. There's a lot of shifting from citizen science to community science in some places. To be pedantic, community science suggests that the community is driving the effort. That is not always accurate. So if you see community science, do not assume that it is community driven. It may be science driven, and that's okay. But there's some confusion about that, and there's some politics around it. So terminology is a little bit of a mess. The degree to which a community, a human community, is driving a citizen science project is really variable. It can be 100% and it can be 10% in terms of who's making things happen, other than just making work get done. So when we look at resilient communities, it's how do we get there, right? And so there's a few critical capacities that make a difference. And they've done some studies across multiple countries of areas where climate-related hazards have really taken their toll. And these are generally vulnerable communities, but the assets that they use to respond to hazards are the same. It's really pretty amazing. The local solutions are variable, but they use the same kinds of resources, whether it's drought, whether it's flood, whether it's wildfire. We rely on the same tool set. And most of these vulnerable communities are featuring indigenous communities, rural folks, pastoral or agricultural spaces, and largely people who don't make much money, right? So these are the folks that we need to really be watching out for, because they're not well positioned to watch out for themselves, much as they might want to. And so just as an example, there are 88 counties in Nebraska that have an average income below the national average. You can also see from this map that Nebraska is largely empty, right? Something like 60% of the population lives in two cities. And you can see the red dots, that's I-80 and the eastern side of the state, right? That's where we have a lot of population. The rest of the state has more cows than people. And that is, we also have double the rate of indigenous residents compared to most states in the US. So actually a lot of where I live is these rural, agricultural, poor indigenous communities. So this is in our backyards too, right? That the hazards we face are different. In Nebraska, it's likely to be flooding and drought. Here, it's likely to be sea level rise, hurricanes, and flooding of a different sort, right? We get river flooding, we get ocean flooding, different things. So there's at least a couple of things that are really critical for all of these communities. Community health. So it is environmental health and public health. If we have a healthy community, we're much more likely to recover, right? And we can't be a healthy community if the environment that we're living in is basically degraded, right? So this is a big piece of it. Another big piece, no matter where you are, is social capital. It's who you know, who you're connected to. It's who you call when the floodwaters rise and the animals have to be moved out, right? So we had this happen a couple of years ago where there's massive flooding in eastern Nebraska, and literally anybody who had a horse trailer just went out and helped people get their animals out of harm's way, right? That's social capital in action. And so everybody needs this. Being disconnected is probably one of the most harmful things we can do for ourselves. So if we want to get to these critical capacities, if we want to build this for people, we have to do it at the community level, because the local context is going to determine what that resilience looks like. We know in general terms, there's what people need to have in their pockets to be able to develop this ability themselves. But what that turns into here versus in Nebraska is going to be very, very different. And the communities actually have to drive this work. We can't impose it. We can't just be like, hey, Fort Warriors, get more resilient. Pull your bootstraps up. That is not going to work. You also cannot buy community resilience, right? Throwing money at the problem absolutely helps, but it is not the only thing that helps, and it's not the true solution. And so I spent a bunch of time looking at all of these resources, which are excellent and easy to find. So if you're ever interested in digging in yourself, Google is your friend, and you will find it. Um, the common message that every single thing I looked at had was community engagement is not optional. It is required. We cannot get there without community engagement. So if we really want to develop climate resilience, all of the guidance that I found focuses on planning and organizing in communities, because what happens after the planning and organizing is up to that community. It's up to what the local group needs, right? And so there's a ton of great resources. If you are interested in pursuing any of this in your own local area, the keywords you need to look for are climate action plan in your city or your county or your state, right? So Omaha is finally doing one, and I'm kind of stoked about that. And I just haven't had a time to get in on the conversation, because when they start these processes is when to start having that conversation. There's so much emphasis on deep public engagement, and what you need to succeed with this community engagement is everything that we see happening as a result of participatory science. So citizen science already accomplishes what we need for community resilience in a lot of ways, right? We need awareness, we need advocacy, we need participation in decision making, we need people to buy in and decide it's worth doing the stuff we can to save our rear ends, right? So, bigger picture, ecology is part of this, participatory science is part of this. We made a claim in 2015 that if we put our efforts into citizen science, it's going to help us out with our natural resource management and with our environmental protections. And the song hasn't changed, right? This is the same story consistently. And clearly, if we care about environmental health because it's key to community health, then we need ecological research, right? And that's a key piece of the picture. Social ecological systems, which is a whole ecology keyword, is like how people and the environment interact. That's really in the foreground here, is how all of this comes together. So it's very complicated and messy, as anything involving humans is. But if we are doing participatory science, we get to a virtuous cycle where we get more good every time we go through these processes. So we get some good science, we do some resource management, we get some good science, we do some resource management, and it builds on itself, and it makes something bigger and better than we initially imagined. And so community-driven participatory science is just perfect for climate resilience work. It isn't everything we need, but it actually ticks a lot of boxes. And ecology as a field actually does know how to make this work. There are lots of great models for how we get citizen science to support the needs of local communities. And there's so much emphasis on this right now in our community, in our space. So climate resilience, this is the claim I'm making, the flag I'm putting on the hill. We need community science to support climate resilience. And there's a couple of things that we get out of it that are key ingredients. We get data that helps our communities set priorities for our climate resilience efforts. And being able to support our decision making with data is really important for a lot of people. We also then develop some capacity for assessing where we're vulnerable and what we have that we can use to address it. Skipping over the local knowledge is a huge mistake, particularly since we need local solutions, right? And local knowledge, traditional knowledge, is incredibly important if we want to really understand climate impacts and how we adapt and how we respond, right? We can also demonstrate the impact of whatever community-driven solutions we try to put into place, because if we're not assessing how effective it is, we might as well spend millions of dollars restoring coral reefs that are just going to get bleached, to paraphrase something I was hearing about just the other day. And we can get better solutions for all of these issues when we get more different minds on the project. There's so much research that's yes, better diversity in your stakeholders, better results, right? So we need as many voices and perspectives as we can get. So let's bring it to coastal ecosystems. Much like urban ecosystems, if you want a sustainable and resilient ecosystem initiative, you need to be able to assess your vulnerabilities. In coastal systems, it's going to primarily, I think, be sea level rise and storm intensity and frequency. But like I said, not a pro on the coasts. I'm a Midwest girl. And that means there's probably some other stuff that should be on that radar. And we also need to look at the quote unquote triple bottom line benefits of ecosystem assets. So that's a bunch of jargon that basically means we need to look at the green space and the blue space, the waterways, and we need to look at green infrastructure, which is like mangroves and things like this that support all of the rest of the community, right? And so when we do monitoring and restoration, that comes out of the communities. It just kind of makes sense because if we have ongoing monitoring, we can have proactive management instead of reactive management. It encourages a culture of stewardship where the local community can hopefully at some point take over for themselves. Like, wouldn't it be awesome if Grouper Moon didn't need Reef anymore? That would be amazing if they could own it to that extent. Of course, I think Reef should stay involved if they can because the data is amazing, but Um, and then there's opportunities for really meaningful action, for things that make people feel like, what I'm doing actually has an impact and I can be hopeful. So if we think about reef monitoring and restoration, it turns out there's multiple citizen science projects that monitor reef health. They look at different aspects of the reefs and how they're doing, different ways of measuring and understanding it. It's not a pretty picture right now. Um, and some of these initiatives support both the science and the management. So typically in citizen science, you're going for one or the other. It's not all that common to be able to get both out of a project. I found one that's out of the Virgin Islands where they essentially are doing research on coral restoration methods, as well as having the citizen scientists themselves help do the restoration work that they're then tracking. So it's like a multi-layered participation structure. I think we need to recognize that because of the kind of work that's involved in diving, um, this is not generally community driven because the communities that are most affected don't have the wealth to be divers, right? The local folks are not the ones who are doing this primarily. So we've got some great science and management, we've got some good monitoring and restoration, but we don't really have the community-driven component. And I see this in a lot of citizen sciences. We have a lot of the parts, but not all the parts, and we need a community-driven component. And so rather than change the citizen science, let's partner. Let's find ways to expand the scope of what we're doing to work with other folks who bring their expertise and their knowledge and their passions to resolve problems that we share, right? So just one random idea that I could come up with after much head scratching, because this is not my space, is like partnering with local groups to track some of the impacts on fish populations or other kinds of outcomes of local interest would be a really reasonable way to show that this work is worthwhile, that the citizen science is paying off, and to help do all of that kind of developing the community and the capacity to take on more of that role themselves. And generally speaking, when you're talking about a vulnerable community, it needs to have an economic or cultural value to the people involved. People who are just barely squeaking by cannot afford to volunteer. And therefore, the economic interest is part of what moves them. It's a little bit existential. And I hate that that's how people get pulled into science. But on the other hand, if they're getting pulled into science, that's great. And we've got some solutions that people can start to engage with. So with all of this, we really have to take communities first. I'm usually addressing scientists, professional scientists. We got citizen scientists here, but kind of all the scientists, but especially the professional scientists, need to play a supporting role for these communities. Instead of being in the front seat, we need to be in the back seat. We need to be putting gas in the tank rather than driving the car. So creating metrics and indicators of local resiliency that the community can realistically monitor. That's something that we're actually trained for and very good at, right? We can also help identify some causal mechanisms, some things that are causing the problems and the issues that people are responding to, right? Again, this is exactly what we're trained for. We have a lot of depth of knowledge in exactly how to get at that stuff that the citizen scientists may not be as well prepared for. So we can really support the work that way. And a lot of the community-driven science that we really need to see happen isn't novel. And this, to me, is one of the big problems in actually getting there, because we need to have this work happen, but the scientists also need to put dinner on the table, and we need to keep our jobs. And that depends on being able to produce research papers with some kind of novelty, right? And because some of the stuff has already been done over and over, there's no novelty to it. So we don't really get the payback that we need career-wise to invest in it. So this is a big systems problem when it comes down to it. Things like environmental quality monitoring, we've done left and right, up and down. There's still cool stuff being developed. New things are happening in that space all the time. Air, water, soil, and human-induced factors are all kind of part of that picture. And then biodiversity monitoring, everybody loves it, but it's not as new and shiny as it once was. So you have to be dipping into something special for that to have the novelty that scientists need to keep their careers on track. There's also resource mapping and kind of these restoration and rehabilitation projects. Unless you are basically establishing methods and assessing their effectiveness, rehabilitation and restoration are not likely to be novel, right? So this is a real challenge for how do you get the professional scientists on board to support the communities in an effective way when the entire system is built to prevent that, essentially, right? Not intentionally, but that's kind of what it adds up to. So I have 4 ingredients that I think will contribute to this. We need to increase awareness. We need to remove barriers on both the community side and the science side. And we need to create incentives and get everybody not just taking the barriers out of the way, but like, let's put the carrot in front of the donkey because then we will move, right? I also think we need 1,000 flowers blooming. And early in my career, I hated this idea of like 10 projects doing reef stuff. I was like, oh, that's so inefficient. Now, we need it localized. We need all the different ways of solving these problems we can get. So I have completely reversed my position on that. Anytime we can do something like what Reef does is pull together data from as many places as possible in a really robust way, that's fabulous. But we also need these other approaches to really get a handle on the problems and come up with robust solutions. So I won't come back to the 1,000 flowers, but increasing awareness, you know, for the scientists, we pretty much have a handle on participatory science. It's still working its way through acceptance, but we don't get that argument about, oh, the data isn't good enough nearly so much anymore, because there are literally hundreds of papers that show that the data is good enough. In fact, sometimes better than professionals, right? So I consider that side of the equation more or less solved, because you can just point people at Google Scholar and say, look it up, we got the data quality in hand. It's just a question of what you're using the data for. What everybody else needs to know is that this stuff works. They're not wasting their time. Their effort means something and is valued. It's designed for them and with them to address their needs. At that point, you're going to get buy-in that you never saw before, because something that's imposed by an external party doesn't tend to go over all that well in a vulnerable community. They have experienced that, and it is not a fun thing for them. They also need to know that they're not the only one who cares, right? We need to know that we are not alone in the effort, and that the results are going to be put to use. It's not just a paper that's sitting in a database somewhere. Somebody's going to make some management decisions. Somebody's going to do some advocacy. Somebody's going to take that to the next level. So the big question of how do we achieve that? These are really big systems to try to nudge along. And for the scientists, we just need to work with these community-based organizations like Group Maroon has done. And we need to work with local climate planning as people who care about this stuff. And that can be a heavy lift for everybody involved. But if we really want to see things shift, that's kind of the direction I think we need to go. So if we want to remove barriers for the scientists, we actually need training. When you do a PhD, you don't get trained to teach, for one thing. You also don't get taught how to share your science with anybody who doesn't have a degree and like a higher degree, right? We don't learn how to engage community. We don't learn how to design a project with a community. We don't learn how to do participatory action research where we're doing management effort along with data collection in concert with a community. That is not how we're taught for the most part. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, right? We also need matchmaking. Scientists aren't always great at making connections with other people, right? Other scientists, sure, after a beer or two, but we really need other parties to help us find our partners to make things happen. So the American Geophysical Union has the Thriving Earth Exchange, where they work with local communities that have acute needs, and they find scientists to match with them so they can help address those needs, flooding issues, for example. We also have something where I'm at the University of Nebraska at Omaha called the Service Learning Academy. And it's basically institutional support for service learning to get our students involved on the ground and invested in doing stuff that supports us all. And so we have a wonderful office of fantastic people with long-running local relationships who are like, oh, you're teaching this and you want to do this. Let me call these 3 people and see if they will work with you on that. And because they have been working on it for a long time, they usually say yes. And we can usually do something really cool with them. And there's also like models where we can involve kids in schools. And so that gets an even richer picture, even more buy-in and engagement. It sounds really mundane, but we also need logistical support. We need somewhere for people to have meetings that's a comfortable, neutral space. University campuses aren't always that. We also really kind of need some project management to help with the coordination. It's an overpaid project manager is what you've got if you're having the scientists do it, and anybody else being able to help fulfill that role. It sounds so trivial, but it makes a huge difference. Now, when it comes to communities, we have some other kinds of barriers we need to remove. So we need to really prioritize their needs and focus. We need to work with those organizations, involve the community leaders, and focus on what they care about, right? So this is for the scientists, like the communities really need to be in the front seat. We need to remove the costs so that folks in these communities can participate. So quite frankly, folks who can afford to dive are not the ones I'm worried about here, right? I'm worried about the folks who can't afford the bus fare to come to a public meeting about something that is affecting them and their family, right? So where equipment is required, if we can loan it, if we can have lending libraries, that is amazing. That means so many more people can participate and we reduce the cost for everybody. If we can reimburse travel for the people who have to go somewhere to do the work, and it's the right people, if we have a way to do that, that is meaningful, because then we can get people participating who otherwise wouldn't. Some of the people I had on the prior slides, if that wasn't arranged for them, if they weren't supported in it, they wouldn't have been out there in the fields, right? And if you really want families and if you want younger folks to buy in, childcare is a really good way to help make that happen. There's a huge gap in volunteerism between the early 20s and the mid 40s, right? The family years for a lot of people are just like service is not on their mind. And that means we have a really divergent population in who actually spends time on some of these projects and really engages. We also have to build a lot of trust. The relationship between vulnerable communities and scientists has not really been good over time. And that's something that like we need to own and work on. And there is actually some really great advice from the Union of Concerned Scientists on how to build that trust again. And sometimes if there's things like power relations that could impact how things go down, like having an explicit agreement up front is a reasonable way to try to address some of those issues before they become problems. And then we really have to follow through, right? People do this work, boots on the ground, invest so much of themselves in it. We need to make sure that they get the results. We need to the extent possible, provide equal access to the resources. And there I'm thinking about data primarily. If we don't have accessible data, I feel like we're really missing a huge opportunity for so many people. And facilitating the use of data sounds easy. It's actually really, really hard. And it's really, really important. So the more people can access and use the data, the more impact we're all having, right? And Reef has been great about that. eBird has been great about that. But by and large, that is not the strong suit in citizen science, which is why I started harping on data management 10 years ago. We also need incentives. So for the scientists, we need to know that our careers aren't in jeopardy if we do this kind of work. Some of us are bullheaded enough to do it anyway, but that's not everybody. And scientists are not actually the most risk tolerant people I've ever met. So that's meaningful, right? We really actually need to deliberately train and support activist scholars, people who aren't afraid to have their values lead their work, right? And that needs to be across sectors, in nonprofits, in government, in academia. We need people who have that background in the science, but also are not afraid to say, like, let's take a stand, let's do something meaningful. And if you have the career security, you can do that. But most of us are not so privileged. And then actually, like, recognizing that work goes a really long way to convincing other people that it's worth taking on. So if we gave Christy a great big award in front of all of her colleagues, people are like, ooh, maybe I should get into that kind of thing, right? It actually really does motivate things for the long run. It's like scientists like Lori, just like everybody else. And then for our communities, we actually need to like make sure that all of our project goals have multiple benefits for multiple parties. Like, get to know them before asking them to do a bunch of work, right? It sounds really basic, but that's not always how it plays out. And for people who are economically insecure, if we're asking them for their time and there's a livelihood concern for them, like, hands down, putting dinner on the table is going to win, right? So sometimes we actually need to pay people. And that's not going to be the case for every project, but there's definitely some that need to think about moving in that direction, especially if they require long duration of engagement or particularly intensive work that might take people away from other opportunities that are important for their families and their livelihoods. And then we also, another one that sounds super basic, is make it really easy to share what we're doing. Give people talking points that are ready to go, give them data and visualizations so they can like learn more and engage with the stuff. Hands down, data is one of the most rewarding things that I've run across in citizen science. Almost everybody wants to see data. They want to see their data in context. They want to see all of the data together. They want to see the data over time. It is unbelievable how much people actually want to see data. It makes my heart so warm. So, coming back to Reef, just to wrap up here, I was trying to think a little bit about like, so how does Reef measure up on this? And I feel a bit like, judge and jury here, and with incomplete knowledge of the entire space. But what I've seen is enormous participation in education efforts, and those are critical to building climate resilience and developing communities that can support themselves in these things. Awareness and education are the first steps to capacity for action. And direct participation is empowering, just like that quote that I had at the start from Gretchen. Um, this education and monitoring work creates communities and it engages communities. It brings people in and it creates a new space. This didn't exist 30 years ago, right? And this is a lovely group of people who have been just so much fun to hang out with. 30 years of building relationships and partnerships, that is nothing to sneeze at. That's a big deal. Like, I don't think the folks in Gruber Moon are getting fists thrown at them anymore, right? But they had to go back after the first time. And that's kind of intimidating. That's tough. So that capital, that social capital is incredibly valuable. And impacted communities are part of the conversation. And that is really, really important for this to actually be really meaningful and to build that capacity that we'd like to see. We had this 6-word story at one of our retreats, and Christie's was opportunities and insights that open doors. And I think it really applies here too, because Reef has created opportunities that open doors for people and insights for all kinds of people that can shift the way that we approach these problems and the way that we understand the value of the work that we're doing. So I think Reef is actually already doing the work of climate resilience. And the next stage question is like, how can your efforts really move these communities further forward? How can we take the next step? How can we make it bigger and better? And with that, thank you. It's been lovely being here, and I am happy to answer any and all questions about citizen science, even if it's completely unrelated to climate resilience.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea. Just a quick question. In your studies, did you look at instructional modality? Specifically, whether it was more effective to have, a live instructor involved in the process, and in areas where it may have been self-directed, what materials may have been more effective than others?
That is a great question. I have not looked closely at it. It is one of the things that actually my students and I continue to look at is how are projects working to communicate with the folks who are doing some of the citizen science work. What kinds of training materials did they provide? What kind of resources did they provide? And how well does that match up with what they are hoping that people take away? Right? Because sometimes this was another shocker that we found in our work with Christy and the other organizations. It's like, oh, well, we want people to learn this, that, and the other thing. Well, where is it in your training materials? It isn't, right? So sometimes we want people to have these skills or understand that stuff, and we actually haven't supported it at all. So to some extent, I think that has to do with access to collaborators with the right background to make sure that we're doing that part of the effort correctly and as effectively as we can, because it's actually kind of hard to find a good collaborator who knows the science communication and the education and outreach stuff that's willing to work with your fumbling scientist self on making that work for as many people as possible. Part of the matchmaking issue.
Hello. Thank you for this wonderful and encouraging talk. But I can't help but think about a couple of experiences recently. The the Goliath grouper situation, where so many of us wrote comments to the Florida Wildlife Commission. There's professional science behind it, and still we lose. The National Marine Sanctuary here in the Florida Keys has been doing a lot of community engagement activities on the new restoration blueprint for the reefs and that, and still feel like the things that we know as citizens, as communities, just aren't getting through or getting negotiated away, and we know that that's politics. So I'm not sure I have a question here, really, maybe just more of a comment about what you said about social capital, giving people something to do and giving people something to do in a group. Then that collective kind of confidence and voice hopefully gradually, gets heard through these. I feel like the policymakers are doing a pretty good job at going through the motions of a lot of engagement and stakeholder, listening sessions. But at the end of the day, it's just really disappointing.
I hear you. I'm
I'm
with
kind
you
of
on that.
crying here about it, but
Yeah. So I have to be a forced optimist about these things because I am by nature a pessimist about them. And that is not a fun way to live. So what I see as the larger issue there is while we think that we are getting the word out, there's a lot of people who haven't heard it over all of the other noise that is kind of taking up our attention, right? And so that's where all of the like bringing your neighbor and your extended family member along for X, Y, or Z actually has a really big impact. And it's like one person at a time. You look at this and it's like, oh, there's community there's like maybe a critical mass or something, but in our own, local communities, we're kind of one-offs, right? And so it's building that local kind of cadre of peers who feel similarly and are willing to say something and do something and reach out. And that's really not easy. Because basically I'm talking about grassroots organizing, and that is famously difficult, because that's really what it would take to kind of address some of these situations. On occasion, we do see it work, but it's not always easy or fast. And so just, I don't know what to say to that other than keep your chin up, keep trying, because we cannot give up.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on both of the two prior questions from a slightly different angle. When we're talking about educational modalities, I think we have a long way to go in this country, and when it comes to science education in particular. And as a mathematician, when it comes to teaching people the math that's really going to be important for them to understand scientific research and things in the future, like statistics and probability, which are largely ignored in the K-12 environment. And on top of that, when you talk about educational modalities, I've had some experience recently. I'm now an instructor in what's called the Green Industries Best Management Program here in Florida. And we go out and we instruct people in the landscape businesses, and they are largely immigrants. Many of them, English is not their first language. And we're working with them. So you can't give them written materials and expect them to read it. Even though the handbooks have been translated into Spanish, many of these people don't read their own first language, never mind the second language. And so it really takes one-on-one instruction with lots of examples. And one of the things that's been a highlight for me in this program has been illustrating for them directly what they do in their landscape business and how it impacts our reefs. So I've put together a demonstration on leaching, for instance, with, food color in sand and water and whatnot. And that really is an eye opener for them. But it's the kind of thing I think we really have to think about. You can't just hand somebody some literature and say, go read this. You also have to hit them where it counts for them. How are they going to put food on the table? What are the things that we're growing, and what do we need to do with the things that we're growing, and how will that impact the reef? You saw in the presentation on the Goliath grouper, the pollution of the waters on the west coast of Florida, the eutrophication that's taking place. How much of that is because we're out there playing golf on fields that are being fertilized the heck out of, because that's the only way you can grow grass? That's where we need to educate people, is it's not just the divers in the room, it's everybody has an impact on the reef. Just a comment.
Everything you said, 100%. Love it. The thing that I have really noticed that has been striking to me is like I got kind of sucked into birding. It was a case study for my dissertation, and it turns out that I have the kind of brain that just loves it, right? And so I couldn't help myself because this is the kind of person I am. I just gush about bird stuff, right? Pretty soon, people bring me random pictures of birds and say, "What is this?" They tell me all the stories about the bird attacking itself in in their deck door. So everything bird related, people bring to me, right? And I always entertain it, and I always have an exchange with them over it. And just sharing that passion makes people pay attention to those things. They didn't pay attention to the fact that there were 17 cardinals at their backyard feeder until someone brought their attention to it, right? And so having somebody to share that with seems to go a really long way towards redirecting people's attention.
So as far as getting people further involved in, citizen science initiatives, in cross-training scientists already for like science communication, I myself, and I know a lot of my like peers, are very interested in getting involved, but I've noticed a lot of barriers as far as like education, and like getting a college education, whether it's monetary or whether it's getting accommodations for being neurodivergent or something, anything like that. What kind of what kind of advice do you have for helping people get involved around like money or accommodation issues?
Oh man, that is a
Sorry,
question.
that's a big one.
Yeah, it is. I wish there were an easy answer on that one. I really deeply do, because persistence seems to be the thing that actually ends up working out for people. The system is not terribly accommodating, and it is enormously frustrating. And one of the few things that I can say from experience is, as a neurodivergent academic, right, I accommodate my students. And the more of us there are, the more we can do that, and the better we can support everybody, right? I also had to work 3 jobs at a time to get through undergrad, and I had to go to the college that gave me the best scholarship, right? And that was all I could do. And I managed to make it work out, but it wasn't easy. And so like I think part of what's really important is for people to see examples of that, which is why I will openly say, like, yes, I'm a queer neurodivergent academic, right? And it's a very vulnerable place to be, but also like if you can see it, you can be it. And so there's a lot of the specifics are going to depend on the individual and circumstances and so on, but there's a lot of momentum towards resolving some of these challenges. It just takes a while to get there. It's hard to be patient though.
Thanks, Andrea, for a great presentation. Lots of thoughts and comments and whatnot. But I'll start with really appreciate hearing the real emphasis on community-driven solutions, right? There's lots of different ways that that's been done poorly in the past. And one of the terms that gets used is parachute science, right? A scientist comes in from above, I see your problem, here's your solution, right?
Never mind that it won't work here.
Never mind, it won't work here, right? And so I've become a real firm believer, and I think it was emphasized here, that the real approach needs to be, how can I help? What do you think the problems are? And so therefore, and I know there's some other science educators in this room, including myself, I won't become a real firm believer that I think one of the most important things we can be teaching in our sciences now is actually cultural competence. Because, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that none of these solutions will only work within the context of the values system of the community you're working in.
Yeah. Oh God. That's a beautiful sentiment that I want to capture and bottle for rainy days. Because I wholly agree that we really need to shift the way that we're thinking about things. And cultural competence is enormously important. Part of what I have bemoaned over the years with this kind of situation is, if you really want to do this work, and a lot of academics do, we actually really want to have this kind of impact, you have to have time to have coffee with people, to sit through their organizing meetings, to really put in the time to build the relationship and the trust so that you can then do the things that are going to have that bottom line impact that everybody wants to see and that are going to make it easy for you to sleep at night, right? And nothing in our system supports that. We don't get taught much about I know about cultural competence because it shows up in discussions on computing, right? In computing education, but the rest of everybody never talks about it, right? It is enormously important, and I don't know what the way to work that in is, except that individual mentors of people who are training to be scientists can at least pass on the, oh, by the way, this is probably really important, and this is probably the best time in your life to start building these relationships and this knowledge that you can then build on for the rest of your career. The earlier you can get started with it, the bigger the impact. So one of the things that I have observed over 13-ish years working with citizen science is the people who have made it the cornerstone of their career as scientists did it as grad students. They got started when they were in training, and so it is a normal, natural way to do science for them, and they learn some of the base skills that you need to make this stuff effective moving forward, and then they continue to level up on how they do that over time. So not just the cultural competence component, but really all of these. I got started in this because I was like fascinated by scientists doing volunteer management. That was my first job out of undergrad, was as an AmeriCorps Vista doing volunteer management, and it is difficult. And I was just like, that is a whole career path in itself. Why are these scientists doing it on top of science? There must be something really interesting happening here, right? And it turns out most scientists don't actually have skills in that. They have to build them on the fly. But if we start trying to train people the little bit at a time, that accumulates, and it is meaningful. But the systemic solutions, I don't yet know where they are, but I will be keeping my eyes open for them.
All right.
You ask deep questions, by the way.
Deep. There was no gimmies there.
No, this is probably the most interesting and challenging set of questions I have had from a talk in 5 years, I would say.
Well done, everybody. Well done.
Bravo, A plus, A plus.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I'm really glad that you were able to join, and I look forward to many, many more years of working on projects together.
We should talk about sabbatical plans.
Oh, ooh. All right. So now the time has come where we will go ahead and break. We're going to go out into the lobby. The lobby is now full of food and fun and drink and all sorts of things. We will be out there for about an hour and a half, and then we'll trickle back in here to have our last talk of the night. Dr. Ben Titus, he's going to be talking to us about anemone fishes and anemones. And I'm sure, I can't wait to hear what he has to share with us. So be sure to stick around, enjoy your break, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah. So good. People were attentive, but I couldn't read the faces. And then all the deep questions. Oh my gosh. I'm like, whoa, you're giving me work for my. It's like no soft tosses.
Reef has allowed me to build a larger community of marine conservation supporters worldwide by connecting people to the ocean through the Volunteer Fish Survey Project.
I've helped with the mitigation of lionfish through publications, outreach, and removal actions.
I've gained first-hand field experience building deep water lionfish traps and educating the public about invasive species. Through Reef, I've been able to share my passion for marine science with others by leading education programs both in person and virtual.
Reef has allowed me to spread diversity and inclusion through marine science by highlighting the voices of minorities in the field.
Reef is committed to using our program's platform and voice to build a better world for the conservation community by reducing barriers and supporting accessibility for all. The Oceans for All Fund is a pooled scholarship fund supported by individuals, businesses, and foundations committed to investing in a more equitable future for marine conservation. By partnering with Reef and adding your voice to this crucial work, you are helping the next generation of ocean stewards gain experience.
Through Reef, my kindergarten and first grade students were able to learn about the invasive lionfish and their impact on the ecosystem.
Go in the ocean to clean up the invasive species.
Creating inclusive opportunities for others to cultivate connections with the ocean regardless of zip code.
Well, my favorite part was snorkeling.
Coral reefs, my first time.
We got to see a lot of wildlife, animal, and sea creatures, and it was really beautiful.
Together, we are making a difference in the health of our marine environment by increasing access and removing financial barriers. Through facilitating virtual field trips at no cost, issuing educational scholarships, and providing financial assistance to our marine conservation interns.
Because of my Reef internship, I've been able to build connections and explore new opportunities to advance my career in marine sciences.
After learning about the Nassau grouper, I want to protect the environment. There is no more overfishing.
You can make a difference by participating in Reef's Oceans for All Fund. You can create opportunities for the next generation of ocean stewards and supporting foundational change in how we work going forward.
Reef is exploration. Reef is empowering.
Reef is impactful.
Reef is preservation.
The ocean's more important than you think.